Hello and welcome to Make It Work, the bi-weekly podcast where we uncover inspiring stories of modern working mamas in Asia who have redefined their career paths whilst putting family first.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wong and welcome to the fourth interview of our special Coaching and Counselor series. Claire Harbour is a single mother of four, the quintessential global citizen with an equally interesting career path. She has worked as a strategy consultant for Louis Vuitton, was also a headhunter, and currently spends her time coaching women leaders going through transitions all over the world. Amongst the many hats she wears, she's currently advisor to the Harvard Business Review, has also written a book, and co-hosts a podcast both entitled Disrupt Your Career, a program interviewing those at the forefront of talent and career management. Claire is especially special to me because through a coaching session with her, she was someone who gave me the courage to actually start this podcast. And here we are now. As a heads up, my conversation with Claire went way over time, but we decided that since it was such a rich conversation, we'd break it up into two, the latter of which will be released next week. Without further ado, join me as we dive right into part one of my conversation with Claire. Hi, Claire. This is so great to see you.
Hi, Sarah. It's lovely to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Well, if you could, please tell us about your story, where you are, where you've been to be where you are today. We'd love to have listeners get a taste of the magnificent Claire.
Wow. That's a big thing to live up to. Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I should say geographically, I'm speaking to you today from Spain. Next month, I'll be in Mexico. The month after, I'll be in London. And the month after that, I'll be in the Ivory Coast. So that might give a flavor to your listeners as to who I am at the ripe old age of 59. But let's go back a little bit and just talk about the fact that I was born in London, but when I was 3 months old, my parents emigrated to the States, where I spent my early childhood. I spent the middle and latter parts of my childhood in Europe, and then began my career in Hong Kong, and then moved around with that career through Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines and Thailand. And from then on, there's been a long time since I started until now. I've always been incredibly curious about people and places and cultures, and I continue to explore in all kinds of different ways. At the beginning of my career, I worked in fashion, luxury, and retail, both as a general manager and as a strategy consultant. And really, it would be right to say that I've had two halves of my career. That first half was all about working in industry, being a general manager, having an incredibly exciting and privileged start to my career because I was running a company by the time I was, I think, 25. So crazy privilege, crazy opportunity, all kinds of mistakes. And then the second half, in which I've focused much more specifically on people, first in headhunting, then in learning and development, and more latterly in the last 10 to 12 years in coaching. I was married to an architect who I actually met at work when I worked in LVMH. And luckily, despite the fact that we ended up not married, we did make 4 amazing children. But I've been divorced since they were 3, 5, 7, and 9, which has made for an interesting journey. The divorce was not my choice, but in fact, with hindsight, which came very quickly, I'm rather glad it happened. I didn't marry the right man, but we made wonderful children, so no regrets. But an interesting journey, that's for sure. So that journey has contained an awful lot of juggling, an awful lot of compromise, many great surprises. And here I am, still alive, still happy, 4 children. So it can be done.
Amazing. Well, Claire, maybe bring us back to the time when you were a young mom and with your 3, 4 kids, then you were also going through a lot of transition personally and professionally. Talk a little bit about how that change started to take root from wanting to go into corporate and slowly moving out into people work and doing what you're doing today, which is coaching.
So I guess I would look at this as several stages, really. I think, when I had my first child, Grace, I was working as a strategy consultant. I was traveling probably 330 days a year, which was my choice. I'd done a very nice deal with my employer to get the clients to pay for my husband to join me wherever I was rather than me go home. So we had this amazing lifestyle of just, doing amazing things, extraordinary things in wonderful places.
Wow.
Obviously, that had to stop once we had a baby. So that was really the first time that I forced to stop and think about who am I? What does work really mean to me? And what can I make of that, both in psychological and emotional terms, but also practical ones? It was very obvious right from the beginning that having a baby would put a stop to that kind of lifestyle. But I didn't immediately stop the job. I struggled a lot with my identity. I think I was somebody who had grown up in an environment and perpetuated an environment in which a person equaled their work. I loved my work. So it was very easy to stay in that sort of paradox of being what my job was. And I struggled with that for a long time. But, I managed. And there were definitely interesting times where I had to figure out how I fitted in with the rest of the world. I didn't want to become a stay-at-home mom, though actually I did have a brief period of postnatal depression. So I did stay at home a little longer than planned with that first child.
Yeah.
But I guess in terms of the way my work shifted, I first of all found practical solutions, which were started by ceasing being a strategy consultant and looking for the next closest thing that didn't involve so much travel, which was sort of top level executive search. And that was a fairly easy transition in the sense that lots of people do it. And I was introduced in the right places and was able to do that. But I guess beyond that was where it got more complicated, because I made an okay choice in terms of the activity. I was very good at headhunting and loved doing it. But more significantly, I chose the wrong kind of environment. I chose this very sort of straight and structured firm that loved very traditional people. And honestly, I think I acted my way into there. And that's a big, flashing light for people who are thinking about where they want to go. I knew that I could look and sound and talk and pretend to think like the people who were working there. And that's what I did, because I thought I wanted to work there. And of course, sooner or later that became evident from both sides that it wasn't really a great fit. I do want to point out that the far bigger change actually was once I found myself with 4 children who were small and alone. The whole challenge suddenly went on every kind of steroids that you can imagine and became, really pretty meaty in terms of figuring out, how do I make a living? Because actually by the time I'd had children 3 and 4, I had stopped working. By this time we were living in another country. We were living in France. And so I had to figure out, how do I get back into the world of work, all the while having 4 young children? But there were a load of compromises that involved not leaving the city we were living in, compromises that involved figuring out what I wanted to do and how that was realistically compatible with my conditions. And one of the things I learned very early on was, whatever your context, try to figure out the client relationships that you want to have that are going to make the way you actually live possible. And that sounds a bit utopian, right? But it doesn't have to be. I was very lucky. I did find work fairly shortly after finding myself alone with the children. But what I did was be very, very frank upfront. And I would tell both my employer and colleagues and the clients that I worked with, listen, I'm sitting at a desk in my own home. There are small children around. They might make noise. They might come and ask me for something. And I would treat that not as something that I would need to ask permission for, but which I was politely explaining. And of course, even that I'm 59 today, this was not during COVID. This was way back in 2005. So it took courage. It took confidence. Like most habits, it became easier and easier to explain that rather than to ask permission for it. Because it opens the field so much larger. If you assume that you can do it, but it will be imperfect, and that imperfection is okay, then there's a lot that can be done. I should also add, some people used to ask me at the time, how do you do it? And the honest answer is, I shouted a lot more than I should have done, and I probably drank a bit too much wine. But, again, we're all still alive, but also because you can, and because in the end, you do it with whatever imperfections show up as well.
Yeah. Well, Claire, I want to dig a little bit into what you mentioned earlier, where you grew up in an environment where you are essentially your work. Was that something that was a result of your family or society? And how did that change along the way? I feel like I'm in such a society and I grew up in such a,
So, yeah, I mean, I know you're looking at a white face from Europe. So you might think, well, but it's Asian families who have that kind of thing. And yes, it is. And I certainly encounter that more in my work with Asian women than I do with, and Latin American. But I would guess in my case, I grew up in a family where my immediate family, my parents were both very hardworking, somewhat successful professionals who placed a lot of store in what they were achieving. And I think I was lucky in that I was smart academically, so I could adhere to those sorts of values that were around me and my family. My dad was a physicist. He worked in Princeton, along with all kinds of very big names. He wasn't necessarily a big name himself, but again, he was striving. So the emulation of you do well and it takes you places was always there. The reality is that I didn't find it pressure. I didn't experience it as one. So because there was sort of this assumption that you're smart, so, you should be able to get into Cambridge, was a definite assumption, Cambridge, not Oxford, not least because by then we lived near Oxford and going to university just down the road wasn't exciting. But, you do well, you take that exam, you get in, and then you figure out what you want to do. And that wasn't unappealing to me. So because I managed to pull it off practically and academically, then I have to say it never felt like a pressure.
And how did that kind of evolve and change as you went along? And if I may even extend to how you parent your children, because they're all doing very different, very, like you said, non-INSEAD jobs.
Yeah. So I would say, I was able to play that game for a long time. I went to Cambridge. I went to work for a big blue chip company in Southeast Asia. I got into INSEAD. I was doing that top level stuff with relative ease. So for all that time, then I could do it. I could manage it easily. What I found little by little was that just because I could do it wasn't a reason to choose to do it. And I think that's a big distinction. It was that question of figuring out the why behind what I was doing. So yeah, I could work for a big company, get promoted, become a general manager, go into strategy consulting, become a project manager, travel all over the world, stay in fancy hotels, work with CEOs. But what I realized little by little was that I didn't particularly like the structures of corporate life. I could play very well in it, but I discovered little by little that I didn't want to be in it. And that came with time. Funnily enough, I looked back at letters that I used to send home during those years of study and early career, and all the signs were there. I was complaining and grumping about, this idiot or that system or why don't they do it this way? Even then, but I wasn't listening to it internally. So I guess I probably just showed up as a grumpy, arrogant young person rather than somebody who was reflecting deeply and doing her inner work, because I wasn't. So by the time I guess that I had that first child and then the second one, then I was definitely questioning everything. And actually, by the time I had Georgia, who's my second daughter, we had moved to the countryside in France. We were looking at different ways of working freelance, not doing, so much, not being under the pressure of living in a city and all that kind of thing. And that's really, I guess, one of the big pivots. And from then on, I've never had a corporate job. And that suited me just fine. I still work with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and C-suites. So I know and understand that environment, but I'm phenomenally happy not to be inside it. Now, as to how I parent my own children and how that aspiration plays out in different ways, again, if we could invite them here, they'd probably all say something fairly similar to what I'm going to say. But of course, there's a mom-child thing too. But I guess in the end, what happened was I was incredibly lucky in that I had these 4 children and they had lots of character, lots of interests. The reality was I was raising them alone in a city where my resources were somewhat limited. And so what tended to happen was that when the first child developed an interest, then the others had to follow. Because in France, Wednesday afternoons are activity afternoons. They're not school. But you have 4 children, you're one mom with one car or one set of legs. You can't take 4 children to 4 different activities. You take them all to the same one. So this curious thing happened. Grace, the oldest, was a kid who asked to do ballet classes when she was very young. I think that came from her grandmother reading her stories about little Angelina Ballerina, the mouse. But we don't really know. But she started very young and she was very good. And so by the time she was 7 and all the other kids were either trailing along and doing ballet classes or swinging on the bars while watching others doing ballet classes because of those constraints, then what I could begin to see was that if she wanted to, she could become a professional dancer. And while that wasn't necessarily my sole aspiration for her, it was what was becoming very evident was going to be likely. And so as I had teachers and other people saying, she should go to National Ballet School and she can be a dancer wherever she wants in the world, then that opened up my mind to the possibility that this child might not go to Cambridge and INSEAD and work in business. And that was a huge liberation because, my first feeling was, resistance. Good grief. Is there any other way of being successful? And then, then I was forced to face the fact that, of course, there were many, many ways of being successful. And so I'm very thankful to her for having broken that mold in me long before she actually caused a need for it, because she didn't actually go away to National Ballet School till she was 15, but she started working when she was 17. She did 3 years of ballet school and then was recruited into the premier contemporary ballet company in the whole world and broke all kinds of records and did all kinds of amazing things, none of which conformed to my previous model of what success looked like. But because, as with so many aspects of parenting, she broke that pattern. She broke that cycle. It then allowed me to open up for all the others to do whatever they wanted to do. The rule really was, if you're going to do it, then do it to the best of your ability. And so, that was the leitmotif throughout, even when they were children and doing whatever activities they did.
Wow, this was very insightful, Claire, about how you were, in a way, reverse parented through your first child because of her interest in dancing, make you wonder about what were your inhibitions about her pursuing it to the nth level. And that is fascinating because, I'm at the early stage of my parenting journey, right? And I have all these hopes and dreams for my 3-year-old and my 1-year-old, but yes, they are in a way a very linear and typical. To hear that it was you opening up your assumptions and lifting barriers that you had mentally because of how you saw her achieving them is definitely very unintuitive to me, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. Well, I would love for us to segue, Claire, into a little bit more of your life and insight as a coach, the Coach Claire hat on, if we may. So you've coached hundreds of ambitious women across different cultures for 20 years. And if I'm not wrong, you've focused exclusively on women. What are the kind of cultural differences that you have seen with regard to this whole challenge that we're talking about, family and life, juggling these different balls?
So I think, first of all, yes, it's fair to say that there are some cultural differences that show up. But I'd say they're probably more nuanced than you might imagine. And, it would be ludicrous in the end to say an Asian woman does this and a non-Asian woman does that. It's really not. It's not that black and white. But I think one of the big areas that I've noticed again and again is reluctance to be in conflict or to have difficult conversations. There's much more of a contrast there than I would say than in many, many areas. So that can manifest in all kinds of ways. Anything from, a young girl at 17 saying to her parents, no, I don't want to go and study accounting and business at university. I want to be a photographer. That's a conversation that's much more likely to happen in a house in London than it is in a house in Hong Kong. But it carries through, and it carries through in work and in family and in all kinds of things. So what that tends to mean is that things get left unsaid, and there's more room for, quiet unhappiness or discontent. And that can lead to all kinds of problems as a result. Quiet discontent is a pretty bad way to find oneself, but it's common. There's often a big contrast in the sense of how much agency one has in creating one's own destiny. So I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong, that even in a place like Singapore, there are lots of children's books that say things like, girls can do whatever they want. And, or in fact, children can do whatever they want. But there's still usually then high school parents, university exam systems that say, yeah, you can do whatever you want within the constrictions of whatever the system is. On the one hand, we're maybe creating a sort of false encouragement in Asian societies and systems where we sort of say you can do what you want, and then we pile this big system on you And this society that's still saying, actually, no, you can't. You have to do what we expect as parents, as grandparents, as school teachers, or whatever.
Yes, I want to over here just make a comment because my 3-year-old is rehearsing for their year-end concert, and the song that they've chosen is obviously "You Can Be Whatever You Want." And the thought did come into my mind where I was like, this doesn't sound very Asian.
Yes, exactly. It's a massive tension. It's a massive tension. And, think of all the tiger moms, and I don't know to what extent you're a tiger mom, but all those tiger moms getting their kids to play the piano. And how many of them are actually going to end up being concert pianists, right? So what are they doing it for?
Yes, I know.
Possibly not. Is it to add to your sort of end of high school score so that you get to a better university? Probably. Do they love it? It's a fascinating dynamic that I love playing with once I get a client who comes in, having come from there. But to many points of view, it shouldn't exist at all, but it does. So we play with what we have rather than fantasize about what we can. And that whole weight of tradition and societal expectations goes very deep and in so many directions. And what I see that often playing out in with Asian women particularly is the question around what's okay or not within an organization. So many women come to me with some sort of blockage in their career. They want to be promoted, but they haven't been. They want to be paid more, but they haven't been. When I just open them up to the possibility that they could ask, that's a complete revelation. They shouldn't have to ask. Asking would be unseemly. So this possibility of asking for what we need, what we want, what we desire, what we dream of, what would make us more comfortable is something that I see again and again as not being automatic, not being assumed amongst most of the Asian women clients that I work with. And actually, I would add, in that particular respect, it probably is more common among Asian women, but it exists among Asian men as well. The whole notion of asking for stuff out of turn is still a difficult one, definitely.
I agree. I mean, I've had my chance living in the US for 5 years, and I was definitely quite affronted at the start, I guess, of how upfront people would be about advocating for themselves. Even this term was something that I had to learn.
Indeed.
That's all the time we had for part 1 of Claire's story. I hope you've learned some good lessons like I did about being reminded that we are much more than what we do for work and how important it is to learn to ask aloud for what we need from a position of confidence rather than fear. Stay tuned for part 2 where Claire shares inspiring stories from women she's coached and bonus practical exercises to help you find your true priorities. See you next week on Make It Work.